white freedom movement. Despite the efforts by the civil rights movement to reform it, the black working class brought at least a degree of liberation to whites who rejected the obligations of citizenship and were attracted not to the suffering and deprivation of African Americans, but to the joys of their culture. A common theme in the writings of the most famous imitators of African Americans in the post-war period, the Beats, is the attempt to overcome their alienation as white middle-class youth through participation in black culture. In Howl, Allen Ginsberg's best minds crashed through bourgeois barriers and into the Negro ghetto to revel in sex, drugs, and emotional catharsis. Jack Kerouac made this desire to be black and free explicit in On the Road. When the novel's hero arrives in Denver, he heads to the black neighborhood. I walked in the Denver colored section, wishing I were a Negro, feeling that the best the white world had offered was not enough ecstasy for me, not enough life, joy, kicks, darkness, music, not enough night. Like many white race traitors, the Beats often reduced black culture to its most sensual aspects, but in doing so, they found a vehicle through which to escape the confines of whiteness and citizenship. The Beats were only a very small part of what became a mass movement of white youth toward African American culture. In the 1950s, the revenue produced by black music grew from less than 5% of the total market to nearly 75%, and by the early 1960s, untold numbers of white Americans owned, listened to, and danced to rhythm and blues records. As was understood by white anti-integrationists who declared that jungle rhythms turned white boys and girls to the level of the animal, the appeal of the sensual and emotional liberation represented by R&B threatened to subvert the social basis of their culture. This threat was manifested most powerfully by the masses of young white women who flocked to R&B concerts, where they were allowed to shed their sexual inhibitions and break racial taboos on the dance floor. Chuck Berry was candid about the meaning of black music for many white women. In songs such as Brown-Eyed Handsome Man and Sweet Little 16, Berry proclaimed that white sexual taboos were being violated not by the black predations of the racist imagination, but by the desires of white women. Berry's boasts were essentially verified by the campaign conducted against him by law enforcement agencies in the late 1950s. He was arrested twice for violation of the Mann Act, which prohibited the transportation of minors across state lines for immoral purposes. One of the cases was dropped after the alleged victim, a white woman, declared not only that her relationship with Berry was entirely consensual, but that she had initiated it. In the second case, Berry was found guilty and sentenced to 3 years in a federal penitentiary. And in 1959, Berry was arrested after a show in Meridian, Mississippi, when a white teenaged fan grabbed him by the neck and kissed him. White men, as well, found black music enormously liberating and were often militant in defending their access to it. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, a black DJ named Shelley Stewart cultivated a large white following in the Birmingham area with his R&B shows on the local black radio station and by spinning records at a weekly whites-only sock hop. In the 1960s, during one of the sock hops, 80 members of the local Ku Klux Klan surrounded the building and threatened to do bodily harm to Stewart for his alleged attempts to dance with white girls. At that point, a large group of the young male dancers, estimated to be several hundred strong, attacked the Klan, allowing Stewart to escape. By the late 1950s, the popularity of R&B among white youth had become so great that it paved the way for the integration of several Southern universities. At Tennessee's Vanderbilt in 1958, editors of the student newspaper extended their love of R&B into a sustained critique of segregation in higher education. In a series of editorials, they compared white oppression to black music with violent repression of civil rights demonstrators, and called for the immediate integration of their campus. At the University of Alabama, in 1962, while the administration was refusing to admit the first black applicants in the school's history, the Cotillion Club conducted a poll among the all-white student body to determine which entertainers should be invited to perform on campus. Though no African Americans were listed among the performers on the poll, Ray Charles won by what the campus newspaper called an overwhelming majority with a write-in vote. The soul singer was duly invited by the president of the Cotillion Club, but the university administration refused to allow him to perform on campus. Charles won the poll again in 1964 and was again barred by the administration. The following year, the chairman of the Southern Student Organizing Committee, a white civil rights group, reported a surprising degree of pro-integration sentiment at the university. And in 1966, facing a student revolt, the administration welcomed none other than James Brown to campus. The musicians who made rock and roll the chief rival of country music on the popular music charts during the 1960s and early 1970s were deeply influenced by black working-class culture. As has been well documented, many white rock performers found their calling in black juke joints and nightclubs or by listening to R&B on the radio, and the music they created challenged all the tenets of American citizenship. These refugees from citizenship and whiteness sought what Dan Emmett and other early blackface minstrels so desperately wanted. Rather than accept their place in American civilization, what W.E.B. Du Bois called so pale and hard and thin a thing, these whites envied what Du Bois called the slaves' sensuous receptivity to the beauty of the world. The fruits of violence. Martin Luther King is rightly thought of as the American apostle of nonviolence, but he participated in one of the great attempted murders of the 20th century. The victim was known by several names. As a man, he was most often called Staggerlee or Dolomite. As a woman, she was Sapphire or Jezebel. The victim of the attempted murder was the bad nigger, a prominent and recurring character in African American folklore from slavery to the present day. The bad nigger lived for pleasure and let nothing get in the way of it. Staggerlee and Dolomite drank hard, refused to work, stole money, and moved relentlessly from one sexual conquest to another. No police officer could stop them, and no jail could hold them. They used razors, knives, and guns against their enemies, and were just as happy to kill a white man or rob his bank as they were to slash a black rival or a cheating woman. Sapphire, Jezebel, and other bad black women who were especially prominent in songs performed by female blues singers celebrated their sexual encounters and killed any man who wronged them. Above all, the bad nigger, male or female, was a solitary figure who would not yield or sacrifice for anyone else. The bad nigger emerged in real life during World War II as the Zoot Suiter, who infected much of American youth with a renegade spirit. The riots in L.A. and Harlem, the Zoot Suit culture, and rebellious youth in general were widely seen as threats to national security. The bad nigger bore the primary responsibility for this, and so a plot to kill him was hatched. After the riots, Earl Warren, the governor of California, who would later argue as a Supreme Court justice that integration was necessary to civilize blacks, ordered a study of the social conditions that created the Zoot Suiters. In Harlem, a young black psychologist named Kenneth Clark interviewed black Zoots who had participated in the riot and published an article in The Journal of Abnormal Psychology, which attempted to explain the antisocial behavior that had caused the riots. During this time, a Swedish social scientist named Gunnar Myrdal was traveling through the ghettos of American cities, conducting field research for a study that would solve the American race problem once and for all. The study, which was titled An American Dilemma, the Negro Problem and Modern Democracy, was published in 1944. The year after the riots. It was a national bestseller and it remains one of the most revered works of American social science. Its pages contained the first plan since Reconstruction to destroy the bad nigger. An American Dilemma argued that black pathologies were the product of slavery and segregation. To Myerdal, the most debilitating of these pathologies were an anti-work ethic, hostility toward whites, sexual deviancy, and what he called the instability of the Negro family. An American Dilemma directed African Americans to seek inclusion within the nation and become assimilated into American culture, but warned that they would not be accepted until they embraced the norms from which they had diverged and acquired the traits held in esteem by the dominant white Americans. Though Myerdal counseled African Americans to assimilate, his sternest admonitions were directed at whites, in particular those in government and business who were undermining the nation's strength by allowing segregation to continue. Sounding very much like the abolitionists who argued that slavery created sloth, Myerdal maintained that integration and assimilation were required for the efficient working of America. Not only occasional acts of violence, but most laziness, carelessness, unreliability, petty stealing, and lying are undoubtedly to be explained as concealed aggression. The truth is that Negroes generally do not feel they have unqualified moral obligations to white people. The voluntary withdrawal, which has intensified the isolation between the two cases, is also an expression of Negro protest under cover. Anxiety about the inefficiency of segregation plagued the leading racial liberals of the post-war era. The Truman administration's push to integrate the armed forces followed the report issued in 1947 by the President's Committee on Civil Rights, which argued that so long as blacks were segregated, they would be poor soldiers and workers. Perhaps the most expensive results of segregation are the least tangible ones. No nation can afford to have its component groups hostile toward one another without feeling the stress. People who live in a state of tension and suspicion cannot use their energy constructively. The frustrations of their restricted existence are translated into aggression against the dominant group. It is not at all surprising that a people relegated to second-class citizenship should behave as second-class citizens. This is true, in varying degrees, of all of our minorities. What we have lost in money, production, invention, citizenship, and leadership as the price for damaged, thwarted personalities, these are beyond estimate. The United States can no longer afford this heavy drain upon its human wealth, its national competence. No one was more important in popularizing the language of racial liberalism than Eleanor Roosevelt. She had been the most aggressive proponent of civil rights in her husband's administration and was the most prominent member of the boards of the NAACP and the Congress on Racial Equality after the war. In hundreds of articles and speeches, she insisted that the United States would not live up to its democratic promise until it gave full citizenship to African Americans. But she, like other racial liberals, understood that citizenship was not just a package of benefits. In 1943, Roosevelt contributed to a series of columns written by whites in the Negro Digest called If I Were a Negro. She acknowledged that African Americans had reason to be angry, but reminded them that citizenship required work and sacrifice. If I were a Negro today, I would know that I had to work hard and to go on accomplishing the best that was possible under present conditions. Even though I was held back by generations of economic equality, I would be proud of those of my race who are gradually fighting to the top in whatever occupation they are engaged in. I would not do too much demanding. I would take every chance that came my way to prove my quality and my ability, and if recognition was slow, I would continue to prove myself, knowing that in the end, good performance has to be acknowledged. I would try to sustain my own faith in myself by counting over my friends, and among them there would undoubtedly be some white people. The Brown v. Board of Education decision contained one footnote, a reference to Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma. The argument in Brown that segregation made blacks pathological was authored by Kenneth Clark, and the man who wrote the decision was Chief Justice Earl Warren. The bad nigger haunts every word of the decision to integrate America's schools. For the first time in American history, black leaders were offered real integration by the federal government. They seized this opportunity to replace the bad nigger with the black citizen. In Montgomery, Alabama, local civil rights leaders spent much of the year after the Brown decision looking for a person to serve as a catalyst and symbol for a bus boycott they had decided to launch. The leaders agreed that the symbol would be female because they believed a black woman would receive more sympathy than a black man. Early in 1955, a candidate did emerge, but she did not meet the requirements of respectability. In March, a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin was forcibly ejected from a bus after disobeying the city's segregation ordinance, and the leaders considered launching a boycott to protect her act of defiance until it was revealed that Colvin was pregnant and unmarried. Unlike Colvin, Rosa Parks was able and willing to project an image of feminine domesticity and respectability. Because she was married, restrained, and an active member of a church, Parks was well suited for her role as the founding mother of the civil rights movement. During the bus boycott, local civil rights leaders described her to the press as mild-mannered and soft-spoken, a lady who was too sweet to even say damn in anger, and a typical American housewife. One white supporter of the boycott said that she looks like the symbol of Mother's Day. What is often missed is that King's philosophy was rooted in a doctrine of violence against the self. It was a doctrine originally presented in the language of war and bloodshed in one of King's favorite texts, the Book of Romans. King often cited chapter 7, verse 23. I see in my bodily members a law at war with the law of my mind, making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. When King said that African Americans needed to undergo a process of self-purification, he was guided by chapter 12, verses 1 to 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. This is the doctrine of asceticism, a profoundly violent idea introduced by Greek philosophers, perfected by the early Christians, and deployed by Martin Luther King against black culture. Of course, the bad nigger lived on in cities all over America, and what our textbooks don't tell us is that in the 1960s, the bad nigger accomplished something quite remarkable. Without assimilating or integrating, he opened the doors of the segregated South. Historians agree that the events of 1963 in Birmingham were pivotal in the history of American race relations. The Civil Rights Act was signed into law the following year, making segregation of public accommodations illegal. Historians also largely agree that the nonviolent demonstrations in May 1963, which allegedly provoked the use of fire hoses and dogs by Bull Connor and his notoriously brutal police department, shamed the local white power structure into forcing desegregation of the Birmingham commercial district. As the story goes, nationally televised images of well-dressed children marching into jail and of protesters being blasted with hoses and attacked by German shepherds at a time when the United States was engaged in a competition with communism for the hearts and minds of dark-skinned people in the Third World, made segregation a contradiction that had to be eliminated. And indeed, shortly after the airing of the police attacks, representatives of the Birmingham city government and Chamber of Commerce signed an agreement to open all parts of the downtown shopping area, including previously segregated jobs, to blacks. It was also during this time that Martin Luther King Jr., who called for the Children's Crusade, penned his famous Letter from Birmingham Jail, which quickly entered the canon of American letters and established nonviolent protest in American culture as not only morally correct, but also the most effective means of social change. But nonviolence was not just a strategy. In his letter, King pointed to its deeper political implication. The nonviolent civil rights movement sought not just desegregation, not just access to space and to the privileges of whites, but integration, which for King and the leaders of the civil rights movement meant the complete merger of the races. It was this goal that made nonviolence a necessary strategy, for as King understood, violent resistance to whites made it impossible for blacks to be welcomed by them. It also damaged what he called the inescapable network of mutuality that tied all people in a single garment of destiny. But what is missing from the narrative of the desegregation of Birmingham is the majority of black people in the city, namely those who did not participate in the movement. The resistance to whites by those people in the years prior to the Children's Crusade is the story that needs to be told. It is a story not of nonviolence and integration, but of violence and the defense of autonomy. The records of the Birmingham Police Department contain hundreds of reports filed by police officers in the 4 years prior to the Civil Rights Campaign that provide detailed descriptions of white encounters with African Americans. These reports indicate with stunning vividness that the all-white, notoriously racist and brutal Birmingham police force and the city's equally famous segregationist civilian population did not go unchallenged, and that the violence in the streets went in both directions. The reports tell of hundreds of ordinary black people punching, kicking, biting, and even stabbing and shooting whites who encroached, even in the slightest ways, on their freedom and autonomy. Another striking aspect of the police reports is how many women participated in these street wars and how fiercely they did so. On the night of April 29, 1962, 2 police officers arrived at the house of John Carter to deliver a citation for a parking violation. The report that documented the subsequent events tell of one ordinary black woman's sense of entitlement and willingness to defend it with means that fell well outside the norms of bourgeois respectability. While the officers were writing the citation, John Carter's wife came out of the house and told John not to sign the citation. The officers told her to go back in the house. She refused to do this and began hollering and causing a scene, which drew a crowd of other colored people. She told the officers that this was a public street and that there was no one that could tell her to leave. The officers placed her under arrest, and she began to fight and scratch at the officers. She attempted to bite Officer Jack Parker's hand. While Officer Parker was scuffling with this black female, her husband made an attempt to jump on Officer Parker. The department studied the number of women arrested during 1959 and found that 17 black women had been arrested for carrying a concealed weapon, while only 1 white woman faced a similar charge during that year. Several reports tell of spontaneous acts of solidarity against police encroachments on black spaces, such as an incident at the Three Sisters Cafe, a club in the black Southside District, on May 7, 1960. When 2 officers entered the cafe and arrested a man and a woman for drunk and disorderly conduct, this caused several other Negroes to become belligerent and to begin cursing the police, and several other patrol cars had to be dispatched to the scene to handle the ensuing melee. Similarly, following a sporting event at the Municipal Auditorium in the summer of 1956, violence broke out between 2 large groups of whites and blacks when a black married couple, Harold and Vinia Lay, with an infant in tow, confronted and cursed out a white man they accused of hitting them with his car. The couple was placed under arrest, but fought against the police and had to be dragged through the street to police headquarters. During the trial, the judge told the couple that their actions nearly caused a race riot. Some of the reports of resisting arrest may be approached by the historian with caution, since there may have been efforts to justify instances of police brutality. However, they date from the late 1950s and early 1960s, before police brutality against African Americans had entered the national discourse, and before any Birmingham police officer had been convicted or punished for unwarranted violence against an African American. Also, most of the reported incidents involved only slight injuries to the suspects, or none at all. There are also many reports of incidents in which an officer involved was injured and the suspect was not. Indeed, during one 18-month period that was studied by the department, on average, one officer per month was seriously injured in a case of resisting arrest. Similar kinds of resistance were directed at white civilians as well. Police and newspaper reports contain numerous accounts of blacks brazenly challenging the power of whites to maintain segregated spaces. In the summer of 1955, white farmers at a downtown market told a group of black youths to leave their stall. When the youths refused, a farmer kicked one of them. The three teenagers then left and returned shortly with two older youth who were armed with pistols. With the armed guard, one of the boys began taunting the farmers. The older boys in the background dared us to make the boy move from in front of our wagon, one farmer reported to the Birmingham News. When we started after him, the older boys opened fire. 2 of the farmers were wounded, and 3 others narrowly missed being hit by the bullets. In 1960, white residents of the Kingston neighborhood, which was divided by race along railroad tracks, complained to the police about groups of black youth using their streets as a shortcut to a housing project, and threatened to arm themselves after their houses were stoned by the trespassers. Over the next several years, whites in this borderland area continued to complain that blacks attacked their homes and then escaped arrest by running back to the black side of the tracks. On the other hand, white incursions into black neighborhoods were often met with violent reprisals. In September 1962, a group of white teenagers drove back and forth along a main thoroughfare in a black neighborhood, and, according to testimony one of them later gave to the police, were yelling and hollering at Negroes, especially Negro girls. When they parked the car, 2 black men grabbed them and beat them up and then went on. A police report filed 1 month later told of a similar incident in which a patrol car responded to a call regarding a stabbing. When the officers arrived at the scene, they found 3 white teenagers, one of whom, Gary Hopkins, had been stabbed in the back. Hopkins said that as he was entering a drugstore, he accidentally bumped into a black male standing in front of the store. He, Hopkins, stated that the black male had his hand on his hip and the elbow sticking out, and this is the part of the Negro's body that he bumped. After he bumped the Negro, they both started threatening and cursing each other. The black male told Hopkins that he had better never see his face up there again, and then stabbed Hopkins in the back. On a Saturday night in October 1960, a black man entered a cafe that was frequented by whites, approached the counter, ordered food, and handed the waitress money. At that point, according to the police report, 2 white customers told the man that he couldn't purchase food there. The waitress told him to wait outside for her to bring it to him. As he walked out of the cafe, several white men followed him, but stopped at the front door. A group of 12 or so black men then came to the front door and, according to the waitress, began cussing and calling names and inviting them outside. At that point, several of the white men rushed outside, but were met by gunshots. One of the whites was wounded, and the black men escaped. Perhaps the most dramatic act of violent resistance in Birmingham was authored by a 20-year-old black woman named Matilda Cunningham. She told the police that on the afternoon of August 8, 1960, 3 white men came to the rear door of her apartment and demanded entrance. When she refused them entrance to her residence, they forced the screen door open and entered. They searched the house inside and then asked Matilda where her husband was. She told them that he was at work. They then told her that they were looking for him to beat him up. They stated that he was a smart nigger, and that he had been seen coming out of a white woman's house in West End. They left at this time and told her they would be back. According to Cunningham, 3 days later the three men returned to her apartment. She stated when she saw them coming, she went to the rear door to see what they wanted. They told her that they were coming inside. She asked them to wait a moment and went back inside the house. She stated that she had a shotgun and went to the rear door, and they started walking off hurriedly. She then fired twice at the men as they were going away. However, no one was hit, and one of the men hollered back that they would return. By 1956, white anxieties about black violence were so great that in the adjacent industrial town of Bessemer, whites became convinced that blacks had organized what they called Push Day, when crowds of blacks would invade the downtown area and push white people off the streets. All off-duty police in Bessemer were called in to patrol downtown, but Push Day never happened. At first glance, several incidents of blacks attacking whites appear to have been not defensive and nothing more than acts of criminal malice. In August 1958, a young white couple walking in a deserted area late at night was set upon by 4 black men who smashed bottles over their heads and cut them with the jagged edges. In a similar incident in March 1961, a group of 6 black people, 4 men and 2 women in their 20s, encountered a lone white man walking down a street, pounced on him, pummeled him, and cut him in the shoulder and hand. There is no evidence to suggest that the black attackers in incidents such as these were motivated by any explicit political mission, but their actions proved to be crucial in the desegregation of Birmingham. Perhaps the most famous image of the civil rights movement was created in May 1963, when Bull Connor loosed fire hoses and police dogs on black people during the nonviolent protests led by King. What is not well known about that image is that the victims in it were not the nonviolent protesters. Rather, they were what historians of the Birmingham movement have described as bystanders, onlookers, spectators, and people along the fringes. These descriptions serve 2 functions. First, they efface the history of autonomous resistance by ordinary African Americans in the city who, it now seems, were far more representative of black Birmingham than were the sons and daughters of civil rights activists who marched themselves into jail. Second, these descriptions assign to African Americans a victimhood that was precisely the identity that King sought to construct in the service of integration and assimilation. Yet, the people who were attacked by Connor's cops were hardly victims, and their actions, before and during the demonstrations, evinced no desire to be integrated or assimilated. In fact, during the May demonstrations, there were far more people throwing rocks and bottles at the police than there were nonviolent protesters. And it was their violence that forced Connor to employ his brutal tactics. The Bull Connor papers show that 4 police officers were injured by rocks, bottles, and bricks in the first week of May, before the use of hoses and dogs. It was not until May 7th, when the rioting had grown so severe that 6 more police officers were injured, that Connor took the course of action that brought him eternal notoriety. Over the next several days, the rioting continued to grow in intensity as thousands of the black residents of the South Side poured out of their homes and into the streets, where they met the police not just with fists and rocks and bottles, but also with knives and guns. More than 10 officers were injured during this street war, including one who received stab wounds and another who was wounded during what he described as a gun battle. But what did all of this accomplish? The answer can be found in the pivotal moment in King's letter from Birmingham jail, when he presents the city's white elite with a choice. He wrote that he stood between 2 forces in the black community, the complacent and conservative middle class that had accepted segregation and what he called a force of bitterness and hatred. "I have tried to stand between these two forces," King wrote, saying that we need to emulate neither the do-nothingism of the complacent nor the hatred and despair of the black nationalist. If the philosophy of nonviolence had not emerged, by now many streets of the South would, I am convinced, be flowing with blood. And I am further convinced that if our white brothers dismiss as rabble-rousers and outside agitators those of us who employ nonviolent, direct action, and if they refuse to support our nonviolent efforts, millions of Negroes will, out of frustration and despair, seek solace and security in black nationalist ideologies, a development that would inevitably lead to a frightening racial nightmare. With our knowledge of the history of black resistance in Birmingham that was not respectable, loving, or seeking reconciliation and inclusion, we can understand why King's threat carried so much weight. If Birmingham's whites did not negotiate with him to open public spaces to blacks, they would have to continue to deal with the forces of hatred and bitterness, those bad people in the streets. Indeed, after several days of rioting, white business and government leaders sat down with the civil rights leader and signed an agreement that allowed blacks full access to commercial and public spaces in the city and desegregated jobs in downtown stores. This was not integration, in that it did not compel African Americans to live with or like whites, but it did allow them to come and go where they liked and as they pleased. And it was won not by appealing to the conscience of whites, nor by seeking admission to the American family, but by making the price of segregation too high to pay. Sidney Smyer, the president of the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce, who brokered the deal with King and the SCLC, said at the time that he was motivated not by love for the Negro, but by the need to regain control of the city. He called himself a segregationist from top to bottom, but said, "What I'm doing is of more interest to our stockholders than anything else I could do for them." He told the Wall Street Journal, "Every dime of our assets is in Birmingham, but 30% of our property is vacant and unproductive. We've got to have growth if we want to develop it, and you can't have it in a city of hate and violence." Smyer later remembered that the only thing we wanted to do was get that shooting and all that, hate, that was just ruining us. It got pretty rough. I didn't feel happy about living up here and didn't know when somebody was going to throw a stick of dynamite or something here in my house. I wanted some peace, too, and that's the honest truth. The bad nigger desegregated the South, and, in one of the great ironies in American history, he did so by speaking through the man whose mission was to wipe him from the face of the earth, the apostle of nonviolence, Martin Luther King. The price of admission. As the civil rights movement ebbed by the middle of the 1960s, so too did the project of normalizing African American sexuality. Unabashedly libidinal soul music and virile blaxploitation superheroes came to dominate black popular culture. Drawing on studies showing increased rates of illegitimacy, divorce, and single-mother households among African Americans, black social scientists and civil rights leaders grieved over the failure of the movement to conform its constituents to the American family ethic. In 1965, C. Eric Lincoln argued that true segregation could not be achieved until the nation, and the Negro, solves a crucial and immediate problem: how to Americanize the fragile, fractured Negro family. In the same year, Kenneth Clark, the author of the NAACP's argument in the Brown case that segregation damaged the black psyche, lamented that the death of legal segregation did not reverse the emasculation of the black male and the rise of the pathological black family. Slavery, discrimination, and poverty made the female the dominant person in the Negro family, Clark wrote. Psychologically, the Negro male could not support his normal desire for dominance. Martin Luther King echoed these sentiments in his last major publication, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?, which appeared in 1967. Agreeing that slavery, segregation, and enforced poverty had removed the black man from his proper role, King saw little improvement in the black family, which he called fragile, deprived, and often psychopathic. He merged his early calls for moral reform with his growing emphasis on government assistance. While not ignoring the fact that the ultimate way to diminish our problems of crime, family disorganization, illegitimacy, and so forth will have to be found through a government program to help the frustrated Negro male find his true masculinity by placing him on his own 2 economic feet, King wrote, "We must do all within our power to approach these goals ourselves." Black poverty caused fragile family relationships which distorted personality development, and one solution would be for the government to fund family counseling to create better personal adjustments. With dimming optimism, King hoped that such measures would bring African Americans into what he called the World House. Historians have yet to acknowledge what King well understood, that personal freedom was included in the price of admission to that house.